Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Flynn Craddy, and I am the Associate Director of the Human Flourishing Program here at Harvard. I'm going to be moderating what I think is going to be a fascinating discussion today. We have three wonderful undergraduates from Harvard to speak to the question, what is a Harvard education for? Before we begin, let me just say a few words about the Human Flourishing Program here at Harvard and our partner. The Human Flourishing Program is an interdisciplinary research and teaching program at Harvard that aims at the really big question: what makes for a good and meaningful life? To answer that question, we draw on a range of disciplines from the quantitative social sciences, fields like sociology and psychology and public health, as well as the humanities, philosophy, theology, and history. We also, in addition to research, we also provide public lectures, reading groups, and mentoring and research opportunities for undergraduates. You can find more out about us if you're interested at hfh.fas.harvard.edu, or since that's quite a mouthful, you can just Google Human Flourishing Harvard and you'll find us. This particular webinar is brought to you in partnership with a wonderful nonprofit educational group here in Cambridge called the Abigail Adams Institute. The Abigail Adams Institute has as a mission the fostering and fortifying of traditional liberal arts education at Harvard, as well as other area campuses in Boston. They fulfill their mission by posing questions about human purpose and meaning that young people need to confront at some point in their education. And throughout the year, they provide a range of wonderful programming opportunities, including reading and discussion groups, workshops, lectures, conversations with faculty, intellectual retreats, and so on. I'll say a little bit more about them at the end, and about some of the programming we have coming up this year. I also want to point out that there is a Q&A feature. A few of you have already discovered it. You can ask a question now or at any point during the webinar. Our hope is to make this experience as conversational as the technology allows for, which might be somewhat limited, but please go ahead and ask a question if you have one. And we have blocked off some time at the end to present those questions to our panelists, and we'd love to answer them. And now let me introduce our panelists. We have three of them, and if they want to start their video, they're welcome to do so now. First, we have Saffron Huang. Saffron is an off-cycle senior graduating in December. She is studying applied math and computer science with a government secondary. She is interested in the sociology of technology. And actually, she's saying right now that she can't start her video. Let me check on that. Sorry, Saffron. There's always something that happens. All right. All right, we're gonna have to figure out that for a second. So let me just do the introductions, and then I'll work through the tech, and then we'll get started. So Saffron is interested in sociology of technology and AI, photography, China studies, and writing. She recently wrote a very provocative essay in Palladium magazine entitled "Harvard Creates Managers Instead of Elites." You can find that easily. It's quite worth a read. And she is joining us from her home in Auckland, New Zealand. Deepak Singh is a rising junior at Harvard, concentrating in philosophy with a secondary in computer science and mathematical science. He's from Salisbury in the UK, but I think is in London at the moment. And at Harvard, he is a discussion leader for the Effective Altruism's Arete Fellowship, as well as a student fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute. Gabrielle Landry is a rising junior from far off North Attleboro, Massachusetts, and she is concentrating in philosophy with a secondary in educational studies. She's an active member in Alpha Pi and is a student fellow associate at the Abigail Adams Institute as well. Thank you all for being here. Let me just take 1 minute to figure out how to, this is a new experience for me, how to get the video going, and then I will start our questions. So I'll stop my video and 1 moment. All right, sorry, I had the wrong box ticked, but I think we're good to go. So if Gabby, Deepak, and Saffron, if you can start your video, thank you so much. Um, and you should be able to unmute yourself as well. The panel title has what I think is a pretty significant question. What is a Harvard education for? And this is a question that my understanding is that Harvard students ask themselves quite a lot, and it seems to be particularly pressing as a question right now. The classroom experience has vanished, and everyone is doing this Zoom lecture. We live in a time of economic uncertainty, and I know a lot of students are concerned about the job market after they graduate. And I think we're also in a time of increasing suspicion about institutions, and especially elite institutions like Harvard. So I just want to pose this question to each of you. What is a Harvard education for? And maybe as an addition, what should be a Harvard education be for? And maybe Gabby, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, thank you so much, Flynn, and thanks for having me. I think this is honestly one of my biggest questions, I think both as a student at Harvard, but also as a student of philosophy, and in particular, philosophy of education. So it's really like the question that's always on my mind, whether thinking about the purpose of K-12 education, but certainly for myself and thinking about the purpose of Harvard education. And so I think it's been something I've thought about ever since my first shopping week, like freshman fall, trying to figure out what kind of courses should I be taking and what four should I choose out of literally hundreds. And it's a question that I think has also influenced my decision to take time off this year, because coming at the midpoint of college and thinking about the past 2 years and sort of what I want to get out of my next 2 years once I return, and hopefully on campus. And I think in some of my studies and thinking so far, I've really thought about the sort of traditional or classical purposes of education. So sort of to promote personal growth or character in a sense, and to also help students engage with fundamental questions of being human, whether through sciences or the humanities. And I think at Harvard, those goals are still very present, but I think that aspect of professionalism is still very much a purpose, especially with the increasing of socioeconomic diversity at Harvard through initiatives like the financial aid initiative, but also just in our world, as you were mentioning, Flynn, with just growing need for a profession after college. And so I really think those are still with us. And I think also for me, one that I've really felt in my classes has been this purpose of challenging and questioning your assumptions and your belief and kind of refining your thinking. As far as what it should be for, this is really the question that I'm trying to figure out. I think I would propose a sort of tentative answer, but yeah, absolutely in conversation with the other panelists here. I think Harvard is in a really unique place to help students engage with life in a variety of ways. I think one of the biggest ways is through thinking about the big questions of various disciplines, no matter what you're studying, like focusing on those big questions and kind of searching after the answers, but also through creating meaningful relationships with peers and mentors and learning from them and growing personally through those relationships. And then finally, through personal reflection and thinking about your role in the world during and after college. And I think that point about after college is what Harvard is really good at as well, because of the immense resources at the school's disposal to give students opportunities to do research, to be leaders, as well as post-grad opportunities and resources, just being a Harvard graduate and having those leadership opportunities open to you. So I think that's where I'll leave it for now.
Yeah, what a great way to start. Saffron, do you want to pick it up from there?
Sure, yeah, I think Gabrielle covered a lot of like really important parts of Harvard education. I think one thing I'll say that is kind of building on from her answer is that I think the big questions that she talks about, I think that that's actually really, really important. And it's not just big questions academically, even though that's a big part of the education. It's big questions for yourself. And I think that a lot of people don't have the luxury and the time and space to sit down with like questions about humanity and about yourself. And, you know, personal reflection is also part of that. And, you know, what role should I play in society, or like, what should society look like? I think that we actually have this massive luxury of like thinking about these things and provided with all the resources to do that. A lot of people don't have the space for it. So I think that we should lean into that a lot more. It feels like a lot of people come here, and instead of doing that, fill up their time with extracurriculars and things that are just make them really, really busy. And I think that does miss a lot of what Harvard has to offer in terms of just like really fulfilling conversations and thinking. Yeah,
that's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, Deepak, how about you?
Yeah, I just want to say I really agree with Saffron's point about the fact that in the future, you know, a lot of people aren't going to have the time or the freedom to sit around and think about the big questions. I think something that's important to think about as well, though, is that there are lots of students at Harvard currently who feel like they don't have the freedom to think about those things. I think coming into Harvard, you're sort of met with like a lot of, lofty ideas about freedom, truth, all these different things that if you're coming into Harvard and trying to just get a good job, because of the circumstances that you need to support your family or whatever, then it's often quite hard to think about those big questions. So I think for me, focusing more on the question of what a Harvard education should be for, I think it should be about empowering you to learn in sort of any situation that you can. So if that's academic, that means, giving you the skills that you need to go further into whatever discipline you want and then move on to more academic studies, whether that's a master's, a PhD, or whatever. Or perhaps it's empowering you to learn in a more vocational setting. So you go on and you do go the pre-professional route, but you do it in a way that allows you to keep these big questions in mind. And I think the way you do that is you foster a sort of environment where people are asking these big questions. They're going out and looking for different opinions. They're trying to learn from their peers. And I think just sort of instilling this concept of learning as a lifelong process that Harvard can sort of accelerate you in having that idea. I think that's sort of the aim of Harvard, in my opinion. So that when you do leave Harvard, that's not the end of you thinking about the big questions. It should be just the start, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think that I was going to respond to that real quick. I think that it's so true, and you can't necessarily tell whether people are doing that thinking through, like, for example, their job title. It's a more longer term thing. Like, just because someone is going to something that seems very like sneaky, for lack of a better word, it's very hard to tell how that fits into a larger picture, but at the very least it should fit into some larger picture. And I think that you point out a really good distinction between the lofty ideas that Harvard tells us when we come in and the actual environment that we're confronted with. And that is much more of a student culture then. I think the administration tries to push students away from pre-professionalism, but I think that they're not very good at knowing how to intervene. And I think that that's one of the biggest disconnects that I've felt at Harvard, where I'm told to do these like incredible things, but everyone around me has, it's very difficult to kind of reconcile.
Yeah, I totally agree with Saffron. I think, especially knowing that Harvard doesn't have like a pre-law major or pre-medicine major, like we know that the administration wants us to get sort of that liberal education in the sense of a wide-ranging classes. But I totally agree with that, the way you phrase it, the disconnect with the student culture and this sort of culture of busyness. I think it's so hard to talk about, like, what is the purpose of Harvard generally, because you really do have like that kind of administrative side and then this sort of student culture side that's always kind of being shaped actively by every individual, and sort of gives rise to a collective sort of culture. And I think that's something I've experienced, definitely like good experiences within the student culture, and also like more disappointing ones too, as throughout the past 2 years.
Yeah, those are all really interesting comments. I was struck. I mean, my impression of Harvard students, I came to Harvard just fairly recently this summer. My impression of Harvard students is they're extraordinarily bright, but also extraordinarily overscheduled. And in a way that I think was not true of me and my peers when I was in college, just, well, actually coming up on 2 decades ago. I wonder if any of you have specific examples that can't come to mind when you're talking about exploring big questions. Harvard has emblazoned right on the motto Veritas, right? That this place is supposed to be a place for the seeking of truth. Are there specific examples of in your kind of Harvard career to date that ways and opportunities you've been able to wrestle with really significant questions about truth or ethics or anything of that sort? Anyone any of you that want to jump in and take that one, feel free.
Sure, I'll jump in. I think for me, in freshman year, I had a really good experience sort of getting closer to a form of truth, insofar as, I had some experiences just after high school that had me sort of questioning my religious beliefs and really leaving me in a place of agnosticism. And then, that would sometimes swing to full-on anti-theism. So, something that's incredibly personal to me, but that does affect my worldview pretty significantly. And, I was in freshman year, I was interested in government, and, government and like a lot of other Harvard concentrators. But then I sort of branched out and I looked in the course catalog and decided, well, maybe Harvard can offer me this chance to take an academic look at my personal life and sort of my beliefs. And I ended up taking a philosophy of religion class. And that was really quite a transformative experience, which is what Dean Khurana and the rest of the administration want you to have. Because I got to sit down and not only engage with all these old texts, with the help of an amazing professor, but also to talk about it with your peers. And for me, like the peers that you have at Harvard are what make Harvard so great. It's the main reason I applied here. It's like the main reason I think that a lot of students, it's the main way I think a lot of students learn, talking to their peers who are all obviously so amazing, so different. And I really got to challenge my own beliefs and formulate them further. And I think that's one way in which I sort of got closer to something I would call truth. But again, it's sometimes quite hard to know where you're going in terms of getting closer to Veritas, because I think it's quite a nebulous concept. It's quite hard to pin it down and work out, what does this mean? If you're, for example, if you're in STEM, I mean, when I'm taking my math classes, I'm sort of a little confused. It doesn't seem to have that much relevance to the big questions in life. But then again, I wonder, I am gaining deeper knowledge of this discipline. Isn't that a form of truth? But, where does this leave me in relation to these big questions? And I think, again, that's just connecting back to this disconnect and this idea of whether, do you need to be like an ascetic in a cave reading great philosophy books and separating yourself from the vocational world, or can you actually imbue your working life with like philosophy and thinking about the truth?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the bigger moments was I made friends with someone who had taken time off and was quite a few years older than me. And he sent me Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke, which is an incredible read. He's writing to a younger poet and sort of giving him life advice and writing advice. And there's a bit in it about how you need to be patient towards everything that is like unresolved and live the questions now. Like, don't be impatient that you don't have an answer yet. Just sort of live it all, and then someday you'll sort of gradually live your way into the answer. And that to me was really powerful, because I'd been like drifting around campus trying to, like, you know, figure out big questions, and it feels like there's no space to discuss them firstly on campus. Like, I felt very confused first year when I realized I wasn't having the like deep 2 a.m. conversations that I expected to have in college with, like, you know, a group of peers with all the free time in the world to just chat about life. And it just felt like no one was really interested, or people didn't make space for it. And I think that, like, the key takeaway from that, like, quote there and what he was telling me was that you really just have to sit with the uncomfortable questions. Like, you can't be like, well, I don't have truth yet. I'm kind of gonna give up, or, you know, I don't have, maybe not necessarily truth, but I don't have like my own kind of like vision or framework or like understanding of the world yet. I probably won't ever find it. Let me just, you know, distract myself with other things. I think the important thing is, for me, was realizing that, like, this is a process, and it is important to, like, kind of keep at it, and like just have the conviction that you, like, know you're going to recognize what's good when you see it, but it's gonna take a minute. And just sort of like throughout the next 4 years, like, you know, I took time off. I've, like, it's just various experiences sort of like led me closer to, like, my kind of framework and beliefs and things, but it's still a work in progress. So I think that it's more about, like, believing in that process.
Well, and if anyone watching here has not read Rilke, it has the great virtue of being very short. So it's something you can read in an hour or so, or hour or two maybe. And so if you are overscheduled but still want to pencil in some time, you could do worse than reading letters to a young poet. Thank you for that. You know, when I asked the question, or posed the question, what is a Harvard education for? I had in mind exactly the kinds of issues that you all have been raising. I also had in mind the kind of public mission of the university. You know, from its very founding, Harvard has had this sort of identity as a place that trains elites for public service. So, you know, in the first years of its training, you know, it's churning out ministers to kind of serve in the churches of Puritan Massachusetts, and then over time that changes, and it becomes a kind of a finishing school for elites from a select number of New England and Northeastern preparatory schools, kind of a very waspy elite, but still with this idea of public service. And today, I think, still wants to have a sort of public mission. I'd be curious to know what you guys think about that. Does Harvard still maintain that mission? What should that be? Any of you, Gabby, maybe if you want to answer that one, or start us off on that question.
Yeah, I think first of all, for me coming to Harvard, I have benefited a lot from the Harvard Financial Aid Initiative. And I think knowing that I was coming and being part of a community of a ever-growing number of students from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds has definitely made me see that Harvard is not like that traditional sense of elitism that maybe I sort of grew up with the image of Harvard being. And I think that's been very important just in being able to, like, if you're looking after truth, you need to be able to speak with people with different life experiences. And I think the growing diversity of Harvard really helps that. At the same time, I think we're considered like elite students, all of us, because we call this elite institution our home. And I think that kind of sense of elitism really comes from what I mentioned before, just with the very well endowed place that is Harvard, along with all of those resources during and after graduation. And I think elite in another sense that it is just home to some very intellectually gifted people, and people who will be great students and great leaders at college and after. I think that since coming to Harvard, I've really heard the mission more kind of what Deepak said before about how Dean Khurana presents it a lot as this place for transformation through the liberal arts. And I think it's very broad in that sense for a reason. And I really like that broadness, because I think that the mission really should be to help create or I guess provide opportunities for students to grow into people who can think about what they believe in a critical way, but also in a space where others are doing the same. So creating that spirit of intellectual camaraderie and debating and conversations. And through things like that to ultimately help us find meaning in whatever we're doing. That being said, I think I've felt kind of disillusioned with that like lofty image a lot. Just being in conversations with students who weren't willing to have open-minded conversations and just feeling very shut down, honestly, like the conversation being somebody would say like, we're not talking about this just because of the nature of maybe it was a controversial issue. And so I guess that disappointment is there at times, but I'm optimistic because I've had other experiences with students who are kind of holding up to that mission of very open-minded debate and sort of seeking after truth, whatever that may mean.
Yeah, I think like Harvard's public image is one that we're going to live with for the rest of our lives, kind of. And it is undeniable that Harvard students, when they graduate and during, are bestowed with a lot of prestige and power. And as long as Harvard has that brand name and the networks and is still producing good research, students are going to be disproportionately influential in society. Like, by and large, Harvard students are elites, and I think that confers a responsibility as well. Like, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, etc. And I think that to call a spade, that's what we are. And people, you know, when there's like anti-intellectual, anti-elite sentiments in society, like we are kind of the people that's directed at. And I think that it's important to grapple with these things, especially now when, you know, there's a lot of polarization and there are a lot of issues in society where it seems like a lack of good leadership is like a massive issue. And so it shows that there's probably a big role that Harvard has to play in like stepping up and creating like good elites, whatever that means. They're producing elites anyway, so we need to create a really good vision of like who that kind of person should be. And, you know, with the financial aid, with the liberal arts, like with all of the resources and networks, I think that's something that Harvard says it wants to do and should be possible. So I think that the public image is sort of like, is kind of weird right now because people have a lot of different opinions on the Ivy League and, you know, on Harvard. But I think that it's up to us to make sure that that's increasingly more of a positive thing, ideally. Yeah, and just like, because, yeah, just being able to like take those risks and think about things on a more holistic level, as I was saying earlier. And basically just producing good people is something that I think will help with like all of this, like including the sort of like public front.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, just to add on, I think something that's important in producing good leaders is, you know, the students, you know, whoever wants to end up being a good leader has to do sort of proactive reflection on how they are trying to do that. They need to sit and think about, you know, what makes a good leader. How do I, in my field, be a good leader? And I think one maybe slight issue that exists at Harvard is that, you know, when you come in, obviously you hear the speeches and everything, but you are sort of constantly told you are the elite, you're the cream of the crop. Whatever it is, you are told that. That's reinforced a lot. And I think generally Harvard students do a pretty good job of not letting it get to their heads too much, but sometimes this almost results in like the opposite problem, where people really self-deprecate a lot, to the extent at which I think people maybe don't do enough of the thinking about what makes a good leader. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, joking amongst Harvard students about like, oh, do you go to Harvard, or we're elite, in the sort of sarcastic way, but maybe not as much conversation about, or internal reflection on, you know, what makes a good leader in my field, and how do I change the course of my Harvard, like my time at Harvard, to be that leader. And I think maybe to that end, Harvard could maybe introduce more sort of direction through its advisors, to make you actively think about that. Because I think unless you're in a field like government, in a lot of other fields, I feel like you don't really get that sort of, those sort of conversations happening about, you know, how do you lead in your field? And I think maybe that's something that Harvard could improve.
That's great.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit, I think definitely through the advisors, but I think also within the academic fields, and like you mentioned, government and history. By nature, you're studying the lives of past leaders. But I wonder if I mean, and history of science as well, like thinking about scientists in the past, I think those classes could do well with thinking about, and honestly, any class. I'm just thinking about my philosophy classes as well. We talk about specific philosophers, but we don't always talk about like what makes a good philosopher, or, you know, what are the virtues or character strengths needed to be a good philosopher or a good educator. I think in my classes for philosophy, we focus on the theories or the ideas of the philosophers, and then education, we might focus more on policy. Was the policy a good one or not? And so I think both with advising and in academics could both do well with more of those conversations through using examples of real people.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I mean, fostering those sorts of conversations are what we hope to do here, and I'm so glad we're getting to do this now. I just was glancing over. We have some really phenomenal questions from our attendees as well. So I want to be sure to leave some time, but I have a couple more. And the question that's come up several times was one of career or vocation afterward. And I started thinking about this in part because Saffron's essay, which she circulated, is quite provocative. And there's this one anecdote that you use, Saffron, where you're talking to a friend about a choice she's making, and she says, well, this will help me preserve optionality. And that was a word that I didn't know, I'd never heard before. But it's really evocative of a kind of mindset of making sure that you have maximum kind of potential and option in life, but not necessarily committing to one thing and kind of doing it with all of your heart. How well does Harvard prepare people for a vocation while at Harvard, but especially after Harvard? And what can they be doing as a university, as a kind of a campus culture, to improve that? And Saffron, I wonder if you would start with that, answering that question.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that the short answer is I don't think that we have enough adequate preparation to think through our vocations. I think that it's a lot of relatively short-term planning and thinking that happens here. So, you know, at OCS, like I've been to OCS a few times, and I'll go in and, you know, ask about like more strategic questions about how I should kind of think about my life. And I've had the advisor tell me, oh, well, you know, I'll send you a list of companies and you just tell me which one that looks interesting to you. And it's just like is a very object level thing that they're thinking about, which is like, how do we prep you for interviews? You know, how do we get these job fairs? Like, how do we get your first decent job, basically? And beyond that, you're kind of left alone, and they don't have the frameworks and the concepts to strategize more generally. So OCS, while the formal responsibility lies with them, they're not doing a particularly good job of it. I think there are also financial incentives for sort of employers that pay a lot of money for, you know, coffee chats and tables at career fairs, and that really limits the scope of what we see. And then among the students, I think that students are sort of stuck in a bubble, and it's hard to see outside of, you know, what did my upperclassman friend do, or what is on the mailing lists, because you get a lot of your job opportunities just from mailing lists. And it's really hard to know where to look to even kind of get out of that and try and see things from a higher level. So in short, I don't think it's very good for that. I think that there are ways that we can think about it better. I think alumni network is fantastic, and not just talking to alum who are 3 or 4 years out, but alum who are like 10 years out. But yeah, I mean, I think vocation is very important, and even taking into account people's various financial situations, etc. I think that there are actually a lot more creative ways we can be thinking about this outside of, oh, I need money, I'm gonna do consulting. Like, I don't think it's actually that linear of a line of a reasoning. I think that we're just like really lacking in creativity for a lot of things. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, Gabby or Deepak?
I'll go. Yeah, I just want to say, I think I definitely agree with a lot of what Saffron had to say. I think I'm going to be reading the article afterwards, because the optionality idea definitely applies to me. That's something that I've thought about definitely while at Harvard. I've been sort of in the boat of thinking, if I commit to one idea, then do I have to give up on learning about X or Y for the rest of my life? And I think that's sort of one thing that pushes people towards wanting to preserve optionality. But beyond that, I think in terms of thinking about your career, one issue that I've had is that coming into Harvard, a lot of the time I'm thinking about, you know, what job do I want after Harvard? And I'm thinking about that question in sort of, you know, what specific careers, and do I want to be like a doctor, an engineer, a you know, investment banker, or whatever it is, that actual career, rather than what kind of work do I want to do. And I think those are different questions, and focusing on the latter is a much better way of sort of creating an arc for your college career. And something that's really helped me focus on that question of what kind of work do I want to do is my time with effective altruism at Harvard. And I think the other panelists might be able to talk about this as well, because I know they're both involved. But the Arete Fellowship makes you sit down and have a really hard think about what kind of work you want to do, because of the kind of impact it will have. And that's something that I think administratively Harvard hasn't really offered. I've never, in a one-on-one conversation with someone who works for Harvard, sat down and thought about, you know, what kind of work do I want to do and why. If I present this specific option that I want to chase, then, you know, at OCS I can get a multitude of options and different pieces of advice on how to chase that specific option. But if I say I want to do good in this particular way, then it's much harder to get any sort of concrete advice. So I think Harvard could do better. I think, you know, when you come in freshman year, the administration doesn't need to scare you and say you need to decide what you're going to be doing when you leave college. They can instead sort of make you start those conversations about what kind of work do you want to do, how do you want to do good. And I know for me, having that conversation completely changed like my life at Harvard. So freshman year, I was studying philosophy and music after switching from government. And then when I sat down and had these conversations with people, with peers, with also career advisors outside of Harvard, and also did my own research and had this sort of actual proactive thinking about what kind of work I want to do, that's when I switched and decided, oh, I want to do philosophy and computer science instead. And I think there are a lot of students out there who would benefit from sort of a really hard proactive look at what kind of work they want to do. And I think that's what Harvard should be focusing on.
Just to really quickly say something about optionality. I very much agree with you, Deepak. I also think that no one does, it's not like keeping your paths open and doing something that's sort of like a blend of everything is not necessarily going to get you as far as picking one thing, doing it super well, and like really just diving in and then like pivoting to something else. There was something I read a while ago that really stuck with me, which was, if you're an expert in like one thing, or you're proven to be really accomplished in one thing, people just think you're good at stuff generally, and it's much easier for you to pivot to something else. So that's the way that I think about things. Like, I really want to go deep and intensely in like a thing, and then like pivot and like do another thing. And I think that a career is so long that you are really able to do that. I don't need to be juggling 5 things, doors at the same time, like 4 of which I'm not really taking, and kind of just being mediocre. Anyway.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, because I think a few points on sort of what both of you have said. I think at Harvard, and Saffron, I can't wait to read your piece, because I think you probably say what I'm about to say. But there's kind of this, like, I guess sort of a paradox of commitment among students, where we're simultaneously overcommitted to a whole bunch of things, and that might include a few different like academic disciplines that we're considering, especially freshmen or sophomores before declaring a concentration, but certainly as you continue with extracurriculars. But at the same time, there's sort of that undercommitment, or like Saffron, what you were saying, kind of being mediocre or doing a lot of things to have that optionality, but not really feeling a real meaning with them. And I think Harvard students are passionate. Like, the word passion gets thrown around so much because people are passionate about a whole bunch of things, but there might be 1 or 2 things in reality that really give that sort of sense of meaning, even if you care deeply about like 5 different activities. And I think that kind of, you have that overcommitment side, and then you have that undercommitment to like a single thing or 2 things that really give you meaning. I think there can also be that kind of social undercommitment in a way, where there's a tendency, especially early on, to make many acquaintances, but to kind of leave optionality among even your friends, where you might not want to invest too much time, just free time, going somewhere or showing up for somebody's performance, or athletic game, or going into Boston with somebody, just getting off campus. And I think part of that is because of the overcommitment side, like logistically schedules are full. But I think also there's kind of this weird tendency to leave options open, even when it comes to who you are friends with. On vocation, I think it was really great, Flynn, that you phrased the question that way, because I think that vocation should be a much more common word than it is among students and among the administration. We have the Office of Career Services, and it really is career focused and job focused. And I think that's okay. But I think it does lack the sort of critical thinking about the kind of work you want to do, like what Deepak was saying. And I think that tends to leave us in a place where we are thinking about our immediate next steps, but not necessarily the kinds of things that will leave us feeling fulfilled in the long run. And I think one place from the administration where I actually kind of felt this coming through was with the previous Bureau of Study Council, which is now the Academic Resource Center. I'll say that I haven't gone to the Academic Resource Center since it opened last year, but I did go to the BSc freshman year. And I was just kind of struggling, feeling very sort of stressed and burnt out academically. And so I went and I spoke with one of their academic counselors. And our conversation, I mean, we talked for like an hour in this very cozy, like their house, the office was in a house on one of the side streets in the square. And we really just had this conversation about the purpose or the why behind what I was doing. And I think having that conversation with somebody who was much older, not just like a young alumni or a peer, was very powerful for me, because she really challenged me to think about what I was, not just what I was doing academically and why it was burning me out, maybe in terms of my schedule, but actually like the purpose behind it and whether I was finding meaning in the things that I was doing. And so I really believe that we should start using vocation more as just as a term in our shared vocabulary at Harvard. And I think I really see the power of mentors, especially older mentors, and how students should, or I guess Harvard should promote that kind of mentorship relationship a little more among advisors and professors. But I think at the same time, students have to be proactive about kind of forging those relationships, because we do have professors who are willing to be mentors to us, but it's a matter of making that time to create those relationships.
Well, that's fantastic. I want to get to some of our audience questions, because we have some good ones. The first is really more of a comment. It says, "Go Gabby and all the other panelists, you guys are doing great." So I'll echo that. The next one, question is from David Chen. Should a Harvard education be any different from any other college's education? Which is a good question. And if not, what does that speak about equity? And if so, how does it contribute to a holistic growth in wisdom in our society? So any one of you that wants to take that one, feel free to jump in.
I'd say I think it sort of necessarily is different just by virtue, obviously, of the crazy resources that Harvard has. Whether structurally the education needs to be sort of like much different to any other liberal arts college, I think is a different question, to which I'd answer probably not, insofar as I think a lot of other universities and colleges, want to, I mean, all universities want to be sort of like high up in their rankings, or, have all those measures that end up with students who perform really well. And I think what that leads to is a lot of people who do sort of model on the high performing schools. And I think as much as possible, I think a lot of small universities will try and model on what Harvard and other elite universities are doing as far as they can. And I think, one of the limiting factors, obviously, in doing that is the lack of resources. So I think whether structurally there should be much different, I'm not so sure. I think, you can, for example, have those conversations about how to use these resources, how to use these networks. But I think, in class, you can definitely think a lot more about your role in civil society and like your role in your field as to how you're going to use what you learn in a way that maybe you can't at another college. But I think the actual structure of learning doesn't necessarily have to be different. However, I do think that Harvard, with sort of all that privilege of resources, is in a better position to sort of experiment with teaching. So one class that I took freshman year was actually an amazing class. It's called Astro Sociology. It's only offered at Harvard, and it's basically about the sociology of sort of alien contact. And the teaching assistant for the teaching fellow for that course was at the education school, and he was a big believer in sort of really shaking up the way that we teach. And what he ended up doing was changing the course structure so that it was much more of a seminar in which, we wrote essays occasionally, but there was really a light focus on grading. And I know that sometimes that can seem sort of, wishy-washy, and people think, oh, it's Harvard. They're not. A lot of these elite universities are sort of being soft on their students. But something that highlighted to me was, because I've been in other classes where they grade very rigorously, but sometimes it's hard to know what the difference is between a 92 and an 89 when it comes to an essay. So I think having that chance to write essays just for the, you know, the pure intellectual experience of it, and sort of discussing it in the end and not having it graded, or just doing it in a different way to how you might in other classes, was a really good experience. And I think that sort of thing is something that really only places like Harvard can pull off well, because they have the resources, and you know, they have all these other rigorous, very rigorous classes doing it in the traditional way. So I think maybe something Harvard can do is sort of experiment more with deviating from traditional learning structures. I think that's something I'd really like to see.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I will say too, I've graded student essays in my days as a TF, and the difference between an 89 and a 92 is often like whether it's the first one you've graded or the last one, and you're getting tired. So sometimes there's not much more to it than that. But no, that's wonderful. Either Gabby or Saffron, do you want to take that question up and carry it?
I think to sort of carry the torch of all the great things Deepak has said, I really liked your point, Deepak, about how Harvard has the opportunity to experiment in ways that maybe other colleges don't. And I think as far as equity or opportunity at other schools goes, this is actually a great place where Harvard can be a leader for other schools. Because when you have a place that is a research university and you have the opportunity to experiment at the undergraduate level and then maybe publish a paper about that educational model, then you have the chance to disseminate that kind of pedagogy throughout other colleges in ways that might really benefit the experiences of other students. I think my personal example kind of, as yours was the Astro Sociology, I think for me, one of those special courses was actually taught by Professor Matthew Lee, who's at the Human Flourishing program. And so I took his course, Conflict, Justice, and Healing, which was offered through the Sociology department last fall. I really loved this course. It was an engaged scholarship course in partnership with the Mindich program at Harvard. It had a number of interdisciplinary units, including with philosophy. And I think it's honestly, I was thinking about this earlier, I think it really is the most, if not the only, the most impactful, if not the only kind of course that I've taken that's really influenced me as a person, not just as a student. And what I mean by this is that in this course, we obviously, as the title suggests, conflict, justice, and healing, we weren't just talking about different conflicts throughout history and sort of conflict management, conflict transformation. We really were thinking about all those things in addition to personal conflict and personal healing and what justice meant to each of us in our relationships. And I honestly I continue to reflect on some of the readings and discussions from that course in my own relationships. And I think that's not really something I can say even for my philosophy classes about ethics. I think this course has been one that has shaped how I really act with other people, which is kind of surprising given that philosophy talks about like ethics and morality. And yeah, so I think that's really my big example on this.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and Dr. Lee is teaching that course again this semester. I'm not sure if drop ad has ended yet. You can still get in it. He's partnering with some national organizations that help children who have been victims of sexual abuse. So there's this continued applied dimension to it, and every student who's taken that class has raved about it. So if you haven't taken it yet and you're a Harvard student, you should look to do it at some point. I have a question here that's a little bit of a hot button one, and it has to do with diversity. I mean, obviously there have been Harvard and diversity have been in the news lately. There have been lawsuits and so on. This question asks about intellectual diversity. So does Harvard encourage intellectual diversity among its students, or is it indifferent to their views? And I'd love to hear what you guys would think about as your based on your experience at Harvard.
I can jump in quickly to kick it off. I think this is like a hot button issue, but a really important one to talk about. And I think it's honestly one that we maybe don't talk about enough in some ways, or we don't talk about in a productive way enough. Coming into Harvard, actually, I wrote an article for the Harvard Political Review. I co-wrote the article with another student in my year, and it was on conservatives in higher education and sort of an exploration of like, what is the conservative experience at Harvard, especially given the sort of increasing number of high profile cancellations going on at institutions of higher learning. And so I think sort of administratively, I would say Harvard is probably, or I guess when it comes to admissions and things like that, I would say they're indifferent. And it just happens that young people going into colleges, there's sort of that liberal tendency if you look at student populations across like almost every college. But I think that when it comes to students, I think this is where students really need to be proactive and sort of reflective at the same time. Because like I mentioned before, I've had conversations, even in my opening days as a freshman, like first conversations with people that I just met being about like politics and religion. And I loved that. And I felt kind of, I wasn't sure if that was a unique experience or not. And I've had a mix of times where I felt like my beliefs were not the common one in the room, including with some student groups that I've been a part of. And I think that when you are surrounded by students who are open, that can make for really, really good conversation and also much deeper friendships. And I think viewing those two things in conjunction, we're not just here for like fierce debate, but we are also here to, when you can make friends with somebody from the other side or someone who thinks really differently from you, that's when you'll really come to a deeper place of understanding. Not just when you have a debate that's super open. That's also good, but when you have a debate that's open, but at the end of the debate, you go and you hang out and you're just growing your friendship, I think that's even more powerful. And I think that's what I would really love to see more in my experience in the student body.
Great. Yeah. Anyone else want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I just want to say I really agree with Gabby that I think students have to be proactive. I think Harvard is generally pretty indifferent to intellectual diversity. I mean, it does sort of, I feel like I have been in a lot of classrooms where there is, a lot of difference in opinion. But if you're at Harvard and you don't want to engage in any kind of debate, you can get through mostly your 4 years without really engaging if you want to. I think it's pretty easy to sort of isolate yourself and find the echo chambers that you want. But I'm not really sure if that's sort of Harvard's place to really like force you to talk to people. I mean, Harvard can't make you be friends with other people. You have to sort of want to do that. I mean, I know for me personally, freshman year, for example, I took Gov 20, the introductory comparative politics course. And in my section, your section is going to be about 10 people taken from a huge student body, so you're only going to have so much variation in political opinion. And there was slight variation, but I didn't have those sort of fierce intellectual debates of like really vastly different opinions that everyone told me college was about. And for me that meant branching out and looking elsewhere, maybe into extracurricular opportunities that all in the end are tied to Harvard. And the only reason you have access to them is because you're at Harvard. So I think it's sometimes unfair to say that Harvard isn't, for intellectual diversity. I mean, for example, freshman year, I sort of considered myself pretty left-wing or maybe like center-left. So I looked for more conservative groups to join and talk to really, see what do I disagree with you about and why do you disagree with me, and have those conversations. And then, talking to them and making friends with those people and realizing, oh, this is why you think the way you do. And just having those conversations is so important. But it's something that I think students need to go out and do themselves. I know for me, for example, just yesterday I was talking to a conservative friend of mine, and it's interesting at Harvard, I feel like a lot of people would be able to count the number of friends they have of the opposite political leaning on one hand. I think the number of Republican friends you have, or if you're a Republican, like the number of Democrat friends you have, often isn't a very high number. But I think it's much more enriching when you do go out and find those opportunities. So, I mean, yesterday I was talking to a conservative friend, and just today I was in a Marxist reading group, and I don't align with either of them politically, but I think they were great conversations, and you need to be proactive and reach out and have those conversations yourself. And it's not something that Harvard can really push you to do themselves.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have that much to add. It's both of you say incredibly important things. I think that it's also like, maybe you don't know that you have friends who aren't so left-leaning because they don't feel comfortable speaking about it. So I think that is an important thing where, freshman year, I remember like figuring out that someone was conservative and being like, oh my God. I'm also not an American, so I think that like entering the American sort of political climate was like a thing that I was really curious about and wanted to know a lot more about. And at the time I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to be like really non-judgmental. Not that I was judgmental, but like I think that people tend to come into conversations with like certain stances and come in with the idea that they're going to defend their stances. And really I just think that everyone needs to listen to each other more and create like spaces for that. So yeah, and I agree that I don't think the administration can do that much about it. A lot of this is more of a student culture thing, not just at Harvard but at other campuses. I don't think that the administration, I can't think of anything, like maybe some of the econ professors are more right-leaning, but like I think it's hard for the administration with this and for many other things in the student body to know how to intervene, and it's unclear whether what they should be doing.
Yeah, well, those are great comments. I mean, I guess presumably, defending virtues like civil discourse and freedom of expression and those sorts of things that allow us to have the kind of conversations that all of you have called so well for. And those are just great comments. We're getting close to the end of our time, and there are some really great questions I think we're not unfortunately going to get to ask or answer. So I just want to close with this one for each of you, and you can answer briefly. Is there a single piece of advice that you would, I think we have a number of freshmen, first-year students who are just a couple weeks into their careers at Harvard. Is there a single piece of advice that you would give those students, whether it's a personal habit to develop, or a class to take, or an activity to get involved in? What would you say to those students? Deepak, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So I think in addition to the thing you'll probably hear as a first year a lot, which is explore, that's like really the most crucial thing in my opinion. I changed my concentration about 4 times. The sort of unique piece of advice, I guess, from me, might sound pretty unappealing, is take some 9 a.m.s and work out whether you're a morning person or not. Because if you find that you can take a 9 a.m., then stacking your morning and having 9 to 12, and then you have the rest of the day free, really gives you so much structure at Harvard. And structure is something that you will find completely changes your time there. Because as great as the 2 or 3 a.m. conversations are, when you're having them every night, then it gets very, very difficult. So I think just making sure that you've got some kind of structure and that you're able to stick to it. And if 9 a.m.s are the way to do it, then maybe swallowing that bitter pill is the way to go.
Yeah, Gabby.
Yeah, I think in addition to some of the things that we've alluded to during this panel, such as don't overcommit yourself, I think that's an important one that I would share. But I think along with that, I would say to really, I guess I would phrase it as invest in your relationships, especially with friends and mentors. I think right now, freshman year, especially freshman fall, can be a very kind of lonely time. And I think that loneliness kind of comes to students throughout their time at Harvard, but I think you can especially feel it during your freshman year because you are still getting adjusted and kind of figuring out, how is this different from my high school kind of life? And how should I navigate this? And how often should I visit home? Or how often should I call my friends from high school and things like that? And I would just say, I think first encourage you, if you are feeling that loneliness, to try to find the hope and the patience in that. It can be hard, but I think just kind of knowing that those will come with time and nurturing of the relationships. And then I think too, realizing that you are surrounded by so many incredible people, including your professors and other mentors who might be on campus or at similar institutions nearby. And just keeping your schedule open so that you can have time to take an impromptu trip off campus or, linger over a meal or a conversation with somebody on the phone or on Zoom. And when you do that and you really are fully present with somebody else, then you can start to build up those relationships that will add so much meaning to your time at Harvard.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I really agree with that. And I struggled a lot with loneliness, especially my first year. But yeah, good things take time. And what I'll also say is that overscheduling yourself is really appealing because it feels like it's a really high stakes race towards something. Oftentimes it feels like you're behind if you're not, but actually it doesn't matter all that much. And for example, like from my personal experience, I focus more on academics, and extracurriculars were just ways for me to try different things. I didn't stick with anything for longer than a year. I'm going into computer science research when I graduate, but I took CSFD sophomore year. And I think that it really, things really don't end up mattering that much. And, if you do less things, as we sort of alluded to, you can do a much better job of them. And I think that's probably the more important thing. I will also say that I think that if you're a first year, try not to do things because your friends are doing them. I think that there's an argument that people are engaged in the most unhealthy types of competition are with people who are most similar to you. I think that people don't tend to kind of resent the people they really basically you don't want to be sort of locked in these zero-sum battles with your peers, because that's really not the point of Harvard. And so I have had many meals with freshmen, and there's a lot of people who say, I don't really know what I want, so I'm just going to join the club that my friends are doing and try and not get behind in this sort of pre-professional race. And actually I think that what you could maybe try and do instead is do something that's radically different. Find your own niche, carve out something that can not only be a potential passion and real interest, but is something that is easier for you to form an identity around than if you're doing something that's the same as everyone else. So I think that trying to find your niche, in short, is what I would recommend. So not exploring by doing all of the big pre-professional clubs and just doing different types of them, but actually trying to find something that is more just yours. Yeah, I think that that's what I would say. And make friends with older people, like try and make friends with kind of, or at least have more conversations with your professors and proctors and people at different life stages to you. What Gabby said about that is something that I really resonate with, where it just provides you a lot more perspective on life and makes things seem like not as big deals as they might seem in the moment.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to each of you, Deepak, Gabby, and Saffron, for your thoughts and your time. You can't hear everyone applauding, but I'm sure they are. And thank you to our attendees as well for your attention and for your thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't take more of them. I mentioned at the beginning of our webinar that I would just highlight a couple of upcoming events. This Thursday night, the Abigail Adams Institute is holding a social event. I think it's going to be in person, but masked and distanced and that sort of thing. At Thursday, September 17th at 5 p.m. You can find more information on their website if you want to learn a little bit more about the programs they're going to be running this semester. They have some good ones. And also the Human Flourishing program is going to be hosting a Zoom reading group on kind of these issues this semester. So we'll look at kind of classical texts on education and learning and its purpose, from Aristotle to C.S. Lewis and a lot of others. They'll be short. We'll probably meet every other week for an hour. So I'll send you out information in an email, follow-up email, and you can find out information on both of those events. I hope some of you will join us. I'll also send out a link to the video of this webinar, and some of you have asked for it already, so you can feel free to share it with friends. Thank you again for your attendance and questions, and thanks again to our fantastic panelists. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend, and look forward to talking more to some of you soon.
Thank you for the wonderful moderation.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, and I just had to look around to see which button to press, but have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.